The letter had traveled 3,000 miles folded inside the lining of a dead man's coat before it ever reached the hands of Alfred Thatcher, and in the 6 years since, he had carried it across 4 territories without once breaking its wax seal. It was the spring of 1878 when he rode into the town of Prairie Bend, Montana Territory, on a bay gelding whose ribs showed through its hide like the slats of an old fence. The town sat in a shallow bowl of land where the Yellowstone country began to soften into grass and cottonwood, a place of maybe 300 souls, a mercantile, a church with a crooked steeple, and a saloon that never quite closed its doors. Alfred had seen 100 towns just like it, and he expected Prairie Bend to be no different, a place to water his horse, take on supplies if his money stretched, and move on by morning. He did not know, as he tied his horse outside the mercantile and stepped down into the dust, that he would not be leaving Prairie Bend for a very long time. The letter rode, as it always did, in the breast pocket of his coat, pressed flat against his heart. The paper had gone soft and gray at the edges from handling, though he handled it only to move it from one coat to the next when the old one wore through. He had never opened it. He had told himself many times that he would find the courage on some quiet night beside a fire, but the years had passed and the courage had not come, and now the letter felt less like paper and more like a stone he had swallowed and could not bring himself to cough up. He was 31 years old that spring, though the sun and the road had put more years than that into the lines around his eyes. He had left his father's farm outside a town called Caledonia, Missouri, in the autumn of 1870, after a quarrel he still could not think about without his jaw going tight. He had been 23 then, full of a young man's certainty that he was owed something the world had not yet given him. He had ridden west with nothing but a saddle, a Henry rifle, and a temper he was still, 8 years later, trying to unlearn. 3 years after he left, a cousin had tracked him down in Abilene, Kansas, with the letter in hand, saying only that his father had died of a fever the winter after Alfred rode off, and that he had asked near the end that this letter be found and given to his son wherever the roads had taken him. The cousin had not known what was written inside, only that Alfred's father had wept while writing it, which was a thing Alfred had never once seen his father do in 23 years of living under his roof. Alfred had taken the letter, thanked his cousin, and ridden on the very next morning. He told himself he needed a quiet place to read it. The quiet place had never come. Instead, there had been cattle drives and mining camps and one bad winter in the Bitterroots that had nearly finished him. And through all of it, the letter had stayed folded and sealed, because Alfred Thatcher was afraid, more afraid than he had ever been of any man or any storm, of what his father might have written to him in his final hours. He feared it was forgiveness he did not deserve. He feared worse that it was none at all. He was thinking of none of this, or trying not to, when he heard the shouting from the street behind the mercantile. There were 3 men on horseback, and one woman standing her ground in front of a wagon loaded with fence posts and coils of wire. The woman had dark hair pulled back beneath a wide straw hat, and even from 30 feet away, Alfred could see that her hands were shaking, not from fear but from fury as she gripped the check reins of her team. "You tell Mr. Grayson," the woman was saying in a voice pitched to carry, "that Fletcher land is not for sale, and it was not for sale last spring when he asked, and it will not be for sale come next spring either. You can ride back and tell him that plain." The largest of the 3 riders, a barrel-chested man with a tobacco-stained mustache, spat into the dust near the wagon wheel. "Mrs. Fletcher, you are a widow woman trying to run 300 acres alone. There is no shame in selling to a man who can put it to use. There is shame," she said, "in men who ride onto a woman's road 3 times in 1 month to tell her what she ought to do with property that was my husband's father's before it was ever mine. Now get off my road, Bo Hicks, before I take a fence post to that horse of yours and see how far you ride without it." The man called Bo Hicks laughed, but it was not a kind laugh. and he walked his horse a step nearer to the wagon, close enough that the woman had to steady her team with both hands. Alfred did not know the particulars of what was happening, did not know the woman's name beyond what he had heard called out, did not know who Grayson was, or what claim he thought he had on her land. But he knew the sound of a man crowding a woman who could not easily step away, and something in him that had been quiet for a long time woke up and would not be told to go back to sleep. He crossed the street without deciding to, the way a man crosses a room toward a fire he has not yet felt the heat of. "That horse looks tired," Alfred said, coming to stand near the wagon's front wheel, close enough now that Bo Hicks turned his attention from the woman to him. "You have been riding him hard from the lather on his neck. Might do him good to walk on home now instead of standing here in the sun." Bo Hicks looked him over, the dust-caked coat, the gaunt horse tied across the street, the Henry rifle in its scabbard. "This is not your business, stranger." "No," Alfred agreed. "It is not. But I have found that a man minding his own business gets a clearer look at other men's, and what I am looking at is 3 of you and 1 of her, and that does not sit easy with me, business or not." For a long moment nobody moved. The woman in the straw hat glanced at Alfred with an expression that held equal parts gratitude and wariness, as though she had learned the hard way that men who rode to a woman's defense sometimes wanted defending from in turn. Bo Hicks's 2 companions exchanged a look, and one of them, younger, with a nervous set to his shoulders, put a hand on his reins as if to turn his horse. "You will regret this," Bo Hicks said, but he said it the way men say such things when they have already decided to leave, needing only the words to cover the retreat. He wheeled his horse and the other 2 followed, and in a moment the 3 of them were nothing but a diminishing plume of dust on the road north out of town. The woman let out a breath Alfred suspected she had been holding since before he arrived. "I thank you," she said, "though I want you to know I would have managed." "I do not doubt it," Alfred said, and found, to his mild surprise, that he meant it entirely. "You had the look of a woman who has managed a good many things." She studied him now with the same wariness she had shown Bo Hicks, though softer at the edges. She was younger than he had first thought, perhaps 26 or 27, with a face that had the kind of beauty that comes from strength rather than softness, sun-browned and clear-eyed, and a small white scar above one eyebrow that told of some old mishap with horses or wire. "Helen Fletcher," she said after a moment, as though deciding he had earned the name. "Alfred Thatcher," he answered and touched the brim of his hat. "You are new to Prairie Bend, Mr. Thatcher." "Passing through," he said. "Or I was, before your friend Bo Hicks made me curious about your trouble." "He is no friend of mine," Helen said, with a flash of the fire that had colored her voice moments before. "He rides for Silas Grayson, who owns most of the cattle range north of the creek and has decided he wants what lies south of it as well, which happens to be my land and my water and my life's work besides." She looked toward the road where the men had vanished, then back at Alfred, and something in her seemed to make a decision. "You would not, by chance, be looking for work, Mr. Thatcher?" "I lost my hired man to a broken leg not 3 weeks past, and I have more fence down than one woman, and her own 2 hands can mend before summer." Alfred looked at his horse, ribs like fence slats, and at the coins in his pocket, which numbered few enough that he had been planning to ask after work in this town regardless of what had just occurred. He thought, too, of the letter against his chest, and of how a man who has nowhere in particular to be might as well be somewhere that needed him. "I might be," he said. "Though I ought to tell you plain, Mrs. Fletcher, that I do not know the first thing about your Mr. Grayson, and I would not want you thinking I have taken up your quarrel out of some notion of chivalry. I only do not care for bullies, and that man had the look of one." "That is reason enough for me," Helen said, and for the first time something like a smile touched her mouth, quick and startled, as though she had forgotten she still had one to give. "The wage is small, Mr. Thatcher, but there is a roof over the bunkhouse that does not leak, and I am not a woman who begrudges a hired man his meals." "That is more than I have had in some months," Alfred said, and meant that too. And so it was decided, there in the dusty street of Prairie Bend, beneath a sky the color of a robin's egg, that Alfred Thatcher would follow Helen Fletcher's wagon south along the creek road to a ranch he had never seen, to mend fences for a woman he had known less than a quarter of an hour, with a letter still sealed and silent against his heart. The Fletcher ranch sat in a wide bend of the creek that gave the town its name, a modest frame house with a porch that wrapped around two sides, a barn weathered gray, and corrals that had clearly been built by someone who understood horses. Helen explained, as the wagon rattled along the rutted road, that the land had belonged to her late husband's father, one of the first men to bring cattle into this stretch of the territory back before the war, and that her husband, Daniel Fletcher, had inherited it and turned a portion of it toward raising horses instead, having a gift for it that his father's cattle never quite matched. "Daniel has been gone 3 years now," Helen said, when Alfred asked, carefully, what had become of him. "A green colt threw him against the corral post. It was quick, they told me, though I have never been sure if they said that to comfort me or because it was true." She did not look at Alfred when she said this, keeping her eyes on the road, and Alfred understood well enough not to press further, recognizing in her voice the particular flatness of a grief long carried and never fully set down. "I am sorry," he said simply, and she nodded, and for a while neither of them spoke again, the only sound the creak of the wagon and the steady clop of hooves on hard-packed earth. The bunkhouse, when Alfred saw it, proved better than Helen's modest description. A single room with a stove, a real bed frame instead of a bedroll on the floor, and a window that looked west toward a line of low hills gone purple in the evening light. He set his few belongings on the bed, the Henry rifle against the wall, and last of all he drew the letter from his coat and set it on the small table beneath the window, where it seemed, in the dim light, to watch him the way it always did, patient and unaccusing and impossible to ignore. He did not open it that night either. He told himself, as he always did, that there would be a better time. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that Alfred had not known he missed until he was living inside it again. He rose before the sun to see to the horses, a fine string of some 15 head that Helen Fletcher had bred and trained herself, including a black stallion of obvious quality that she called Ranger, and clearly loved the way some women love a wayward brother. Alfred mended fence through the mornings, the wire biting into his palms until calluses formed over the old scars from other ranches, other fences, other lives he had left behind him. In the afternoons, Helen often worked alongside him, and it did not take many days for Alfred to see that she was not a woman who directed labor from a porch chair while others sweated for her. She worked as hard as any man he had ridden with, harder than most, with a quiet, determined competence that put to shame anything he had expected of a rancher's widow. "You handle a hammer like you have done it before," she observed one afternoon, watching him drive a staple into a post with 3 clean strokes. "My father kept a farm in Missouri," Alfred said, before he had quite decided to say it. "Corn and hogs mostly, though he ran a few head of cattle besides. I mended enough fence in my boyhood to last 3 lifetimes." He paused, surprised at himself, for he did not often speak of his father to strangers, and Helen Fletcher was, despite the days they had now shared, still very much a stranger. "Is he still farming it?" she asked, not looking up from the wire she was splicing. "He is dead," Alfred said. "Some years now." Helen looked up at that, and something passed between them, an understanding of shared loss that needed no further words to cement it. "Then we have that in common, Mr. Thatcher. You and I, the dead, do not leave us so much as they leave a shape behind, and we spend the rest of our days learning to live around it." Alfred said nothing, but he thought of the letter on the table beneath the bunkhouse window, and of the shape his father had left behind, a shape he had been circling for 8 years without ever once stepping close enough to see its true form. It was perhaps a week into his employment that Alfred first saw Silas Grayson himself. The man rode into the ranch yard on a fine gray horse, flanked by 2 riders, Bo Hicks among them, and though he was dressed well, in a black coat and a silk vest that seemed out of place amid the dust of the yard, there was nothing fine about the coldness in his pale eyes. "Mrs. Fletcher," Grayson said, touching his hat with an exaggerated courtesy that Alfred distrusted on sight. "I had hoped we might speak, as neighbors do." "We are speaking, Mr. Grayson," Helen said, coming out onto the porch with her chin lifted. "Though I do not know that neighbors is the word I would choose for men who send hired hands to threaten a woman on the public road." "Threaten is a strong word," Grayson said, with a thin smile. "My men were only conveying an offer, which I will convey again myself, since you seem to have taken it poorly. I will pay you a fair price for this land, Mrs. Fletcher, fair by any measure, and you may take that money and live comfortably in town, or wherever else you please, free of the burden of running 300 acres alone." "It is not a burden," Helen said. "It is my home, and it was my husband's before me, and his father's before him, and I intend to die on it a very old woman, long after you have given up this foolishness, Mr. Grayson." Grayson's smile did not waver, but something behind his eyes went harder, the way still water goes hard with the first freeze of winter. His gaze slid to Alfred, who stood near the corral with a coil of wire over one shoulder, watching the exchange without a word. "You have hired help, I see. New help." He said the word new as though it were an insult in itself. "I have," Helen said. "Mr. Thatcher is a fine hand with horses and with fence, and I expect he will be with me a good long while." "Is that so?" Grayson's eyes lingered on Alfred a moment longer, appraising him the way a man appraises a horse he suspects of being unsound. "Well, a woman ought to have protection, I suppose, out here alone, though protection is a poor substitute in the end for good sense." He touched his hat again, wheeled his gray horse, and rode out of the yard with his men trailing after, and it was a long moment before either Alfred or Helen spoke. "He will not stop," Helen said quietly, watching the dust settle. "He has wanted this water since before Daniel died. The creek runs strong through my land and weak through his, and he has never forgiven the accident of geography that put the good water on Fletcher ground instead of his own." "Why does he want it so badly?" Alfred asked. "That he would send men to threaten a widow on a public road?" "Because he means to be the biggest cattle operation in this end of the territory," Helen said. "And a man cannot run 5,000 head on a creek that goes dry every August. My water is the only water for 10 miles that does not fail in summer. Without it, his herds are limited to what the land can naturally support. With it, he could double his operation and drive every small rancher between here and the Musselshell out of business inside 5 years. She sighed, and some of the fire went out of her, replaced by a weariness that made her look, for a moment, older than her years. "I have fought him for 3 years now, Mr. Thatcher. I do not know how much longer I can keep fighting alone." "You are not alone," Alfred said, before he had quite thought about the weight of the words, "so long as I am drawing wages here." Helen looked at him, surprised, and Alfred found he could not quite meet her eyes, feeling suddenly that he had promised more than a hired hand ought to promise, and yet not wishing to take the words back. "That is kind of you, Mr. Thatcher," Helen said softly. "Kinder, perhaps, than you know." Summer came on in earnest through the following weeks, the grass along the creek growing tall and green, the horses growing fat and sleek under Helen's careful management, and Alfred found himself settling into the rhythm of the ranch with an ease that unsettled him more than any danger Silas Grayson might pose. He had not stayed anywhere longer than a season in 8 years of drifting. He had told himself in every town and every camp that he was not a man built for staying, that the road was easier than the alternative, which was to plant himself somewhere and risk the particular grief of losing a place he had come to love. But Prairie Bend, and the Fletcher ranch most of all, was beginning to feel less like a place he was passing through and more like a place he might, if he let himself, call home. It was Helen, more than the land, who made him feel this way, though he did not yet dare put the feeling into words, even to himself. He watched her work the black stallion, Ranger, in the round corral on a Sunday afternoon when there was no fence to mend, and no reason for either of them to be out in the sun, except that neither wished to be indoors. She moved with a quiet authority that the horse responded to instantly. No whip, no harsh word, only the steady pressure of her will meeting the horse's own, until the animal that had reared and fought at the start of the session was following her around the corral at a walk with its nose nearly touching her shoulder. "You have a gift," Alfred said, from where he leaned against the corral rail. "Daniel taught me," Helen said, not stopping her work. "He used to say a horse only fights you when it does not trust you, and the whole art of training is nothing more than earning that trust as quickly and as honestly as you can." She paused, and Ranger stopped alongside her, blowing softly through his nose. "I think it is true of people as well, though people are slower to admit when they are afraid." "Are you afraid?" Alfred asked before he could stop himself. "Of Grayson, I mean." Helen considered the question with the same seriousness she gave to the horse. "I am afraid of losing this place," she said at last. "I am afraid of what it would mean, to have Daniel's life's work and his father's before him, taken by a man who only wants it for the water beneath it, and none of what it means to actually live here. But I am not afraid the way I once was, Mr. Thatcher. Not since you came." The words hung in the warm air between them, and Alfred felt something in his chest tighten, not unpleasantly, but with the particular ache of a man unused to being needed. "I will not let him take it from you," he said, and this time he did not soften the promise or wonder if he had overstepped. "Not while I have breath in me." Helen looked at him then, really looked, in a way she had not quite allowed herself to before, and something passed between them that neither named aloud, though both felt it settle into the space between their hearts like a seed finding good soil. It was some nights later, over a supper of venison stew that Helen had cooked and insisted Alfred share at her table rather than eat alone in the bunkhouse, that she asked him the question he had been dreading since the day he arrived. "What is it," she asked, "that you carry in your coat, Mr. Thatcher? I have seen you touch it when you think no one is watching. A letter, I think, from the shape of it." Alfred set down his spoon. He had not realized his habit was so visible, had thought his moments of touching the letter through the fabric of his coat were private, unobserved. "It is a letter," he admitted, "from my father, written before he died." "You have not opened it," Helen said. It was not a question. "No. Why not?" Alfred was quiet for a long moment, turning the question over as he had turned it over 1,000 times in his own mind without ever finding an answer that satisfied him. "I left home angry," he said finally. "My father wanted me to stay, to take on the farm, to marry a girl from the next county whose family he had known since before I was born. I wanted none of it. We quarreled, the worst quarrel of my life, and I said things to him I have never forgiven myself for saying, and then I rode away and did not look back, and 3 years later a cousin found me in Kansas with this letter, and told me my father had died of a fever that winter, and had written this before the end and asked that it be found and given to me." He drew a breath. "I do not know what he wrote, Mrs. Fletcher. I have imagined it 1,000 ways. Sometimes I imagine he forgave me, and that is almost worse than the alternative, because I do not know that I could bear such forgiveness, not deserving it as I do not. And sometimes I imagine he did not forgive me at all, that he wrote only to tell me what I already believed, that I was a poor excuse for a son who broke his heart in his final years. I have carried it 8 years now, and I have never found the courage to know which it is." Helen was quiet for a long time after he finished speaking, her eyes soft with an understanding that held no judgment in it. "My husband and I quarreled the morning he died," she said at last. "It was a small thing, foolish really, about whether to sell a colt to a buyer from Helena or hold him for the spring sales. Daniel wanted to sell. I wanted to wait. We argued over breakfast, and he left the table without finishing his coffee, and 3 hours later he was dead in the corral, and the last words I ever said to my husband were spoken in anger over a horse that did not matter at all in the end." Her voice caught, just slightly, and she pressed on before the catch could become something more. "I tell you this, Mr. Thatcher, because I understand something of what it is to carry words you cannot take back. But I have learned, in 3 years of carrying that grief, that the not knowing is its own kind of poison. You have imagined every terrible thing your father might have written, and in doing so you have made yourself the judge, jury, and executioner of a man who is no longer here to speak for himself. Do not you think he deserves to have his own words heard, rather than the words your fear has invented for him?" Alfred said nothing, but the words settled into him with a weight that would not soon lift, and that night back in the bunkhouse, he sat for a long while with the letter in his hands, turning it over in the lamplight before at last setting it down again, still sealed, and telling himself, as he always did, that there would be a better time. But something in him had shifted, all the same, even if he could not yet act upon it. The trouble with Grayson did not wait long to resurface. 10 days after that supper, Alfred woke before dawn to the smell of smoke, and found the north pasture fence not merely cut but burned in 3 places, the dry summer grass along the fence line scorched black in a line that told him plainly this had been no accident. He roused Helen, and together they rode the fence line in the gray early light, and Helen's face went pale and then hard as she surveyed the damage. "This is Grayson's work," she said. "He grows bolder, or more desperate," Alfred said. "A man does not burn a fence unless he believes his other methods have failed him." He crouched near one of the burned posts, examining the ground. 2 riders, maybe 3, came in from the north along the ridge, which means they know this land well enough to avoid the creek crossing where we would have heard them. "Bo Hicks," Helen said. "He has ridden this range for Grayson 3 years now. He would know every crossing on it." They spent the better part of the day repairing the damage, and it was hard, hot work, made harder by the anger that simmered beneath both their efforts. Alfred found himself watching Helen as she worked, noting the set of her jaw, the fierce competence with which she drove each new post, and he understood that whatever fear she carried for the ranch, it did not diminish her capacity to fight for it. He admired her for that more than he had words to say, and found himself, in stolen moments between the labor, simply watching her, memorizing the way the afternoon light caught the loose strands of hair at her neck, the way her brow furrowed in concentration, the way she laughed, briefly and unexpectedly, when Ranger nosed at her pocket looking for the apple she sometimes carried for him. That evening, exhausted and sore, they sat together on the porch steps as the sun went down, too tired for supper, content simply to rest in each other's company. "I have been thinking," Helen said after a long silence, "that I ought to ride into town tomorrow and speak with the sheriff about this. Sheriff Coyle is not the most industrious man I have ever known, but a burned fence is a crime, and he ought at least to make a show of investigating it." "Do you trust him?" Alfred asked. Helen considered this honestly. "I trust that he does not want trouble, which in a town this size is often the same thing as trusting a man to do the right thing, since trouble tends to follow when wrongs go unaddressed. But I do not trust him to stand against Grayson if it comes to a real confrontation. Grayson has money, and money buys a great deal of cooperation in a town as small as this one. Then perhaps," Alfred said slowly, "it should not come to a confrontation that depends on the sheriff standing against him." Helen looked at him sideways. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Alfred said, "that a man like Grayson thrives on being the only power worth reckoning with in a place like this. If there were a federal presence, a marshal, someone whose authority did not depend on Grayson's goodwill or the town's fear of losing his business, that might change the calculation considerably." "There is a marshal's office in Bozeman," Helen said, considering. 3 days' ride from here, though. It has always seemed too far to matter for troubles like ours." "Perhaps it is time it mattered," Alfred said. They did not act on the thought immediately, for there was fence still to mend and horses still to tend, and 100 small tasks that could not wait for larger schemes. But the idea took root between them, and in the weeks that followed, It grew alongside something else that had also taken root and was growing steadily, whether either of them was quite ready to name it or not. It was on an evening in late July, warm and golden with the particular light that comes only in the last hour before dusk in that high country, that Alfred and Helen rode out together to check the horses on the far pasture, a task that did not strictly require two riders but which neither had suggested doing alone. They found the herd grazing peacefully near the creek, and dismounted to let their own horses drink, and for a while they simply stood together in the quiet, watching the young horses play in the shallows while the mares grazed nearby. "Daniel used to bring me out here," Helen said softly, "in the early days before we married. He wanted to show me the land he loved most, and this was it, this bend in the creek where the cottonwoods grow thick enough to give shade even at midday. He asked me to marry him, not far from where we are standing now." Alfred said nothing, understanding that she was not asking for a response so much as sharing something precious, and he felt no jealousy in the sharing, only a quiet gladness that she trusted him enough to offer it. "I loved him very much," Helen continued. "I want you to know that, Mr. Thatcher, because I think what I am about to say might otherwise sound like a betrayal of that love, and it is not. It took me a long time to understand that loving someone new does not erase the love you carried for someone gone. It only makes room alongside it." She turned to face him, and in the golden light her eyes were bright with something that made Alfred's heart beat faster than any danger Grayson's men had yet posed. "I have come to care for you, Alfred, deeply. I did not expect to, and I fought against it for longer than perhaps you know, telling myself it was too soon, that it would be disloyal to Daniel's memory, that a drifter who might ride on any morning was no man to give my heart to. But you have not ridden on, not in 3 months now, and I find I no longer wish you to." Alfred's throat had gone tight, and it took him a long moment to find his voice. "Helen," he said, using her given name for the first time, and finding it fit his mouth as though he had been saying it all his life, "I have not ridden on because I could not imagine riding anywhere that did not have you in it. I told myself when I came to this town that I was a man built for the road, that I did not stay in places, that staying only invited grief when the staying inevitably ended. But I do not believe that anymore. I believe I was only waiting all these years to find a place worth staying for, and a person worth staying for besides, and I have found both here in you." He reached out slowly and took her hand, and she did not pull away. "I love you, Helen Fletcher. I did not intend to. I do not think a man ever intends it, but I do, with everything I have left to give." Helen's eyes filled with tears that she did not try to hide, and she stepped closer, and Alfred, moving as though in a dream he had not dared to dream, bent his head and kissed her there in the golden evening light, with the horses grazing nearby and the creek running soft over its stones. And it was the first moment in 8 years of wandering that Alfred Thatcher felt, entirely and without reservation, that he had come home. They rode back to the ranch house in a silence that held none of the awkwardness silence sometimes carries between two people newly declared to each other, but rather a kind of quiet joy, a sense of rightness that neither wished to disturb with too many words. That night, Alfred sat again with the letter in his hands, and though he still did not open it, he found himself speaking aloud, quietly, in the lamplit dark of the bunkhouse, as though his father might somehow hear him. "I have found her, Pa," he said. "I do not know if you would approve. I do not know if you would even recognize the man I have become out here, so far from Caledonia and everything you ever knew of me. But I have found a good woman and good land, and I think, for the first time since I left your house, that I might have found the life I was always meant to live, even if it took me the long way around to find it." He paused, and his voice grew rougher. "I am sorry, Pa, for everything I said. I do not know if I will ever have the courage to read what you wrote to me, but I want you to know, wherever you are, that I am sorry, and that I have missed you every day since I left, even when my pride would not let me admit it." He set the letter down at last, not opened, but for the first time in years, he felt something loosen in his chest, as though the mere act of speaking his regret aloud had lifted a portion of the weight he had carried so long. The following weeks passed in a haze of quiet happiness that Alfred had never expected to know again, tempered always by the ongoing shadow of Silas Grayson's ambitions. Helen and Alfred grew closer with each passing day, sharing meals, sharing work, sharing the small tender moments that accumulate between two people falling deeper into love. A touch of hands over a shared task, a glance held a moment too long across the supper table, a laugh shared at some small joke that would have meant nothing to anyone else but meant everything to them. Alfred found himself, for the first time in his adult life, imagining a future rather than merely enduring a present, imagining winters spent by the fire with Helen beside him, imagining the ranch thriving under their combined care, imagining, though he hardly dared to shape the thought fully, children who might someday run through these same pastures. But Silas Grayson had not given up his designs on the Fletcher water, and as August wore toward its close, his patience, such as it had ever been, wore thin alongside it. It began with the well. Helen discovered it on a Tuesday morning, drawing water for the horses only to find it thick and foul, tasting of something bitter that no well ought to taste of. Alfred rode immediately to examine it, and found, near the wellhead, boot prints that did not match either his own or Helen's, and traces of a white residue along the stone lining that suggested some manner of poison had been introduced deliberately. "This is no accident," Alfred said, his voice tight with a fury he had not felt in years. "This is attempted murder, Helen, plain as I have ever seen it. A well like this serves the horses and it serves us both. Whoever did this did not care whether it was a horse or a person who drank from it first." Helen's face had gone white, but her voice, when she spoke, was steady. "We must ride to Bozeman," she said. "Today. This has gone beyond fences and threats. If Grayson is willing to poison a well, he is willing to see one of us dead, and I will not wait for him to succeed at it." They rode for Bozeman that very afternoon, leaving the ranch in the temporary care of a neighboring family, the Aldridges, who had long sympathized with Helen's troubles and were glad enough to help, particularly once Alfred explained, grimly, what had been found at the well. The ride took the better part of 3 days, hard riding through country that grew steadily more mountainous as they approached the young but growing town of Bozeman, and it was there, in a squat log building that served as the federal marshal's office, that they found a measure of hope in the form of a deputy marshal named Wade Corrigan, a lean, weathered man who listened to their account with a growing frown. "Grayson," Corrigan said when they had finished. "I know the name. There have been other complaints, from smaller outfits along that stretch of the Yellowstone, though none so serious as poisoned water. Fence cutting, cattle running off, threats made against men too frightened to sign a formal complaint. It has been difficult to act without a clear pattern, but a poisoned well with witnesses to the damage, that is a different matter entirely. That is attempted murder under territorial law, and I intend to see it prosecuted as such." "You will come, then?" Helen asked. "To Prairie Bend?" "I will come," Corrigan said, "though I ask you to understand it may take some days to organize properly. I will need to gather what evidence I can, and I would not put it past a man like Grayson to have men watching for exactly this kind of visit, given how brazen his actions have grown. We will need to move carefully." They rode back toward Prairie Bend with cautious relief, though the journey was not without its own tension, for both Alfred and Helen understood that Grayson, learning of their trip to Bozeman, might grow desperate enough to act before the marshal could arrive. They rode harder on the return than they had on the journey out, and it was well past dark on the third night when they finally crested the last ridge before the Fletcher ranch and saw, with hearts that seized with dread, an orange glow flickering against the night sky where the barn ought to have stood dark and quiet. "No," Helen breathed, and spurred her horse forward before Alfred could even call out, and he followed hard after her, his own heart pounding with a fear that had nothing to do with fire and everything to do with what, or who, might be waiting in that fire's light. They came down into the ranch yard to find the barn engulfed, flames licking high against the black sky, and figures moving in the firelight, men on horseback, at least 4 of them, and among the chaos, Helen's cry of fury and terror as she saw one of the riders holding fast to the bridle of her own horse Ranger, dragging the terrified animal from the burning corral. "Get away from him!" Helen screamed and was off her own horse before Alfred could stop her, running toward the man even as Alfred shouted her name. The rider, who Alfred now recognized in the firelight as Bo Hicks, raised his free hand, and in it was a pistol, and time seemed to slow to nothing as Alfred saw the barrel swing toward Helen. "Helen, down!" Alfred bellowed, already swinging from his own saddle, already reaching for the Henry rifle he had drawn from its scabbard without conscious thought. And Helen dropped low and to the side even as the shot rang out, the bullet passing wide of her, and Alfred fired back, not to kill, for even in the chaos of the moment some part of him held to Helen's earlier admonition against needless violence, but low and true toward Bo Hicks's mount. The shot grazing the animal's flank just enough to send it rearing and bucking, throwing its rider hard to the ground and releasing Ranger's bridle in the same motion. The other riders, seeing their companion thrown and Alfred advancing with rifle raised, shouted to one another in alarm, and in the confusion of fire and shadow and rearing horses, they broke and fled, spurring their mounts hard out of the yard and into the darkness beyond, leaving Bo Hicks winded and groaning in the dirt where he had fallen. Alfred reached Helen in 3 long strides, pulling her up from where she had thrown herself flat, checking her over with hands that shook despite his best effort to steady them. "Are you hurt? Helen, look at me, are you hurt?" "I am well," Helen said, though her voice trembled badly. "I am well, Alfred, but the barn—" "Let the barn burn," Alfred said fiercely, pulling her against him. "I do not care about the barn. I care about you." He held her for a long moment, both of them breathing hard, the heat of the fire washing over them, before the practical urgency of the situation reasserted itself, and they turned together to see what might yet be saved. They managed to lead the remaining horses clear of the burning structure, and though the barn itself was lost by morning, nothing but a smoking ruin of blackened timbers, the house had been spared, and more importantly, both Helen and Alfred had survived the night. Bo Hicks, still groaning from his fall, was bound with rope from the tack room and left under Alfred's watchful eye until dawn, when a rider was sent to fetch Sheriff Coyle from town, and word, too, was sent racing toward Bozeman for Deputy Marshal Corrigan, informing him that the matter he had promised to investigate had turned, in his absence, into something far more urgent. Sheriff Coyle arrived by mid-morning, looking uncomfortable at the sight of Bo Hicks bound and sullen on the ranch house porch, and more uncomfortable still when Helen recounted the events of the previous night with a fury that left no room for the sheriff's usual practice of finding reasons to delay action. "This man attempted to shoot me, Sheriff Coyle," Helen said, "on my own land, after his employer's men burned my barn and poisoned my well. I do not know what arrangement you have come to with Silas Grayson over these past years, and I do not much care to know, but I will tell you plainly that if you do not arrest this man today, I will ride to Bozeman myself and see to it that every newspaper in the territory knows the name of the sheriff who let attempted murder go unpunished because he feared offending a rich man's purse." Whatever comfortable arrangement Sheriff Coyle might have maintained with Silas Grayson over the preceding years, it evidently did not extend to being named in the territorial newspapers as complicit in attempted murder, for he arrested Bo Hicks on the spot, and by the time Deputy Marshal Corrigan arrived 3 days later with 2 additional men deputized for the purpose, there was already a case building against not only Bo Hicks but, through his testimony, given readily once he understood the severity of the charges he faced alone, against Silas Grayson himself. The confrontation with Grayson, when it came, was almost anticlimactic in its swiftness. Corrigan rode to Grayson's ranch with his deputies and Sheriff Coyle in tow, and though Grayson protested his innocence loudly and at length, the combination of Bo Hicks's confession, the physical evidence of the poisoned well, and the testimony of Helen and Alfred as to the pattern of escalating violence proved more than sufficient for Corrigan to place Grayson under arrest, to be transported to Bozeman for trial on charges that included conspiracy to commit arson and attempted murder. "You have not won anything," Grayson said to Helen, as he was led away in irons, his voice cold with a hatred that had finally shed its veneer of civility. "There will be other men who want that water, Mrs. Fletcher. You cannot fight the whole world alone." "I am not alone," Helen said, and reached for Alfred's hand, and Grayson's face twisted with a bitterness that had no further words to express itself, and he said nothing more as he was led to the wagon that would carry him toward the justice that had, at last, caught up with his ambitions. In the weeks that followed, with Grayson's trial pending and the immediate danger past, life at the Fletcher ranch settled into a calm that felt, to Alfred, almost unfamiliar after months of tension. The barn was rebuilt with help from neighbors, the Aldridges chief among them, and from townsfolk who had long resented Grayson's bullying but had lacked the courage to stand against him while his power remained unchecked. The well was cleared and tested, found safe, and the horses returned to their usual grazing without further incident. And through it all, Alfred and Helen's love deepened, tempered now by the fire, quite literally, that they had weathered together, until it seemed to both of them a settled thing, certain and unshakable, needing only the formal recognition that both, in their own quiet ways, had already given it in their hearts. It was on a clear evening in September, the first hint of autumn cooling the air after the long summer's heat, that Alfred finally found the courage to open the letter. He had not planned it. He and Helen had been sitting together on the porch, as had become their custom in the evenings, when she noticed, as she often did, his hand drifting to touch the shape of the letter through his coat. "You still have not read it," she said gently. "No," Alfred admitted. "Do you think you ever will?" Alfred considered the question with a seriousness that surprised him, for he realized, sitting there with Helen's hand warm in his own, the barn rebuilt and standing solid against the darkening sky, Grayson's threat finally lifted from their lives, that something in him had shifted enough to make the answer different than it had been for 8 long years. "I think," he said slowly, "that I have been afraid all this time that whatever my father wrote would be the last word on who I am to him, and I did not want that last word to be a condemnation. But I have been thinking these past months of something you said to me once about not wanting to be the judge and jury of a man who cannot speak for himself." He drew a long breath. "I think I am ready now, Helen. I think, with you beside me, I might finally have the courage to know." Helen said nothing, only tightened her hand around his, and together they went inside, and Alfred lit the lamp on the kitchen table, and with hands that trembled more than he cared to admit, he drew the letter from his coat for what he knew would be the final time, and broke the seal that had held for 8 years. The paper inside was brittle and yellowed, the ink faded but still legible, written in his father's careful, deliberate hand, the same hand that had taught Alfred his letters at that same kitchen table's twin, 1,000 miles east and 8 years gone. "My dear son," the letter began, and Alfred's breath caught at the tenderness of those first 3 words, so unlike the stern, unyielding man he remembered from the morning of their quarrel. "If this letter finds you, it will mean I have not lived to see you again. And to that I say only that a man ought not carry regrets to his grave that he had the chance to set down before going. I have carried a heavy one these 3 years since you rode away, and I mean to set it down now, in the only way left to me. I was wrong, Alfred, wrong to try and bind you to a life you did not choose for yourself, wrong to speak to you as I did that morning, wrong to let my pride keep me from riding after you before you had gone too far to call back. I told myself in the months after you left that you would come to see the sense in what I wanted for you, that you would tire of the road and come home chastened and grateful for the farm waiting for you. I understand now, lying here with a fever that the doctor tells me I will not shake, that I was a foolish old man who mistook control for love, and who nearly lost his son entirely because he could not admit that a young man's dreams are his own to chase, not his father's to dictate. I do not know what has become of you, out there in the wide world. I hope you have found work that suits your hands and your heart both. I hope you have found friends, and perhaps, if fortune has been kind, someone to love. For I know now, too late, that love given freely and without the chains I tried to place on yours is the only love worth having, and the only love that lasts. I forgive you, son, for whatever you think you owe forgiveness for, though I do not believe you owe me any at all. It is I who ask your forgiveness, for the years I spent trying to shape you into a smaller man than you were meant to be. Whatever life you have found for yourself out there, I hope it is a good one, and I hope you have found in it the freedom I should have given you freely, instead of forcing you to take it by force of your own will. I love you, Alfred. I have always loved you, even in my worst and most stubborn moments, and if I could have one final wish, it would be that you find it in your heart to remember that love, rather than the anger of our last morning together. Your father, Josiah Thatcher Alfred, read the letter twice through, his vision blurring more with each line, and when he finished the second reading, he set it down on the table with hands that shook openly now, and put his face in those same hands, and wept, for the first time since the day he had learned of his father's death, wept for the years of fear that had kept these words locked away from him, wept for the forgiveness he had spent 8 years believing himself unworthy of, and wept, too, with a strange and unexpected joy at the knowledge that his father had died not in anger but in love, and that the terrible shape he had carried in his chest all these years had been, all along, nothing more sinister than a father's tender, aching love for his son. Helen said nothing through his weeping, only came to sit beside him and put her arms around him and let him grieve and heal in the same breath, and when at last he had quieted, she took his face gently in her hands and looked at him with an expression of such tenderness that Alfred felt, for the first time in 8 years, entirely and completely free. He loved you, Helen said softly. He loved you very much, Alfred. He did, Alfred said, his voice rough but steady now. He did, and I spent 8 years afraid to know it, when I might have carried that knowledge as a comfort instead of a fear, if only I had found the courage sooner. You found it when you needed to, Helen said. There is no shame in that, Alfred. Some griefs take the time they take and no faster. Alfred looked at her then, this woman who had walked with him through fire, both literal and otherwise, who had taught him, without perhaps ever fully intending to, how to set down burdens he had carried for far too long, and he knew, with a certainty that settled into him like the letter's words finally settling into peace, that he did not wish to spend another day of his life without her beside him. Helen, he said, I do not have much to offer you. A drifter's savings, which are not much to speak of, and a horse and a rifle, and now, I suppose, a letter that has finally taught me what it means to be loved without conditions. But I love you entirely and without reservation, and I would be the proudest man in this territory if you would consent to be my wife. Helen's eyes filled with tears of her own, though these were tears of joy rather than grief, and she did not hesitate before answering. Yes, Alfred. Yes, 1,000 times yes. I have loved you since the day you stood up to Bo Hicks in the street without knowing a single thing about me or my troubles, and I have known for months now that I wish to spend the rest of my days beside you. Yes. They were married in October, in the small church with the crooked steeple, with the whole of Prairie Bend in attendance, for word of Grayson's arrest, and the courage of the widow Fletcher and her drifter-turned hired hand had spread through the town and the surrounding country, and there was hardly a family within 20 miles who did not wish to celebrate a victory so hard won, and a love so plainly deserved. The Aldridges brought food enough to feed twice the guests who came, and old Sheriff Coyle, perhaps eager to demonstrate a change of heart after his earlier reluctance, arranged for the church bell to be rung the whole length of the ceremony, and Deputy Marshal Corrigan, who had grown fond of both Alfred and Helen over the course of Grayson's prosecution, rode down from Bozeman especially to stand as a witness to the vows. Silas Grayson was tried that winter in Bozeman and found guilty on charges of conspiracy to commit arson and attempted murder, sentenced to 15 years in the territorial prison, a sentence that effectively ended his ambition toward the Fletcher water and allowed Helen, and now Alfred alongside her, to build their life together without the shadow of his threats hanging over every season. The ranch prospered in the years that followed. Alfred, it turned out, had as much a gift for horses as Helen did, though his gift ran more toward gentling the difficult ones, the horses other men had given up on, and together they built a reputation across the territory for producing some of the finest saddle stock north of the Yellowstone. The bunkhouse that had once housed a lonely drifter was expanded to house additional hands as the operation grew, and the burned barn, rebuilt in the autumn of Grayson's arrest, stood strong and weathered gray within a few years, indistinguishable from a structure that had stood a lifetime. Their first child, a son, was born in the summer of 1879, not quite a year after their wedding, and they named him Josiah, after Alfred's father, a choice that brought tears to Alfred's eyes when Helen first suggested it, for he understood it as a gift beyond measure, a way of honoring the forgiveness that had finally been permitted to reach him. Josiah Thatcher grew into a sturdy, sunburned boy who took to horses from nearly the moment he could walk, following his father through the corrals with a solemn determination that made both his parents laugh with a fondness too large for words. 2 years later came a daughter, whom they named Ruth after Helen's own mother, long past but fondly remembered, and Ruth Thatcher grew to have her mother's fierce spirit and her father's patient hands, a combination that made her, by the time she was old enough to sit a horse alone, nearly as skilled a hand with the ranch's stock as either of her parents had been at twice her age. Alfred kept his father's letter, framed now behind glass, above the mantel in the ranch house he and Helen had built additions onto over the years, a modest but comfortable home that had grown alongside their family and their fortunes both. He would sometimes catch young Josiah, or later Ruth, standing before it, tracing the faded words with a curious finger, and he would tell them, when they were old enough to understand, the story of the letter he had carried unopened for 8 long years, and of the fear that had kept it sealed, and of the love that had finally given him the courage to read it, and of the grandfather they had never known but whose love had shaped, in ways neither child could fully grasp until they themselves were grown, the very family into which they had been born. Helen, for her part, never tired of hearing Alfred tell the story, though she had heard it 100 times by the time their children were old enough to ask for it themselves, for she understood, better than anyone, what it had cost him to finally open that letter, and what it had given him in return, a peace that had settled into every corner of the life they had built together. They would sit together on the porch some evenings, long after the children had gone to bed, watching the sun set over the same creek where Alfred had first told her he loved her, the water running clear and strong through Fletcher land, safe now from any man who might have wished to steal it away, and Helen would rest her head against Alfred's shoulder, and Alfred would wrap his arm around her, and neither of them would need to say anything at all, for everything that needed saying had long since been said. In words and in letters and in the quiet, steady work of 2 hearts choosing, day after day, to build a life together. Alfred Thatcher had ridden into Prairie Bend, Montana Territory, in the spring of 1878, as a man with nothing to his name but a tired horse, a rifle, and a letter he could not bring himself to open, a drifter with no place in the world he could call his own. He left that same road behind him entirely in the years that followed, becoming instead a husband, a father, and a man at peace with the ghosts he had once carried, All because a woman named Helen Fletcher had stood her ground against three men on a dusty street, and a stranger passing through had decided, on nothing more than an instinct against bullies, to stop and stand with her. It was, Alfred often thought in his quieter moments, watching his children grow tall and strong under the wide Montana sky, the finest decision he had ever made, and the truest home he had ever found. And he never, not once in all the years that followed, regretted a single mile of the long road that had finally, faithfully, led him there.